The phone call came on a Tuesday evening when I was closing the hardware store where I had worked for the last 12 years. Marcus was my stepson, a man I had known for only 4 years but had come to see as the son I never had. His voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Robert, I need to talk to you about something serious. Can we meet? Tonight." There was an urgency in his voice that made my stomach clench. Marcus was not a man prone to drama. He was practical, logical, the kind of person who didn't call without a genuine reason. I told him I would meet him at the coffee shop downtown, closed the store, and drove through the darkening streets of Jacksonville, my mind already spinning with possibilities. What could have happened? Was he sick? Had there been an accident? By the time I reached the coffee shop, I had created a dozen scenarios in my head, none of them good. Marcus was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, and one look at his face told me this was serious. He was a handsome man, 42 years old, with the kind of confidence that came from years of success in the real estate business. But tonight that confidence was shattered. He looked like a man who had just discovered his house was built on sand. "Robert," he began, not even waiting for me to sit down, "I need your help, and I don't know how to ask you this without making it sound terrible." "Just tell me," I said, sitting across from him. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out." He took a deep breath and began a story that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I could never have anticipated. Marcus had been investing in commercial properties across the Southeast, using borrowed capital to leverage increasingly larger deals. The strategy had worked beautifully for 5 years. He had made millions. He and his wife, Patricia, lived in an 8-bedroom mansion. They drove luxury cars. They traveled to Europe twice a year. But then the market shifted. One of his major investments failed. Then another. He had overextended himself, and now the consequences were coming due. He owed $17 million to various investors and financial institutions. His business was collapsing. His marriage was falling apart. And within 30 days, several creditors were going to start legal proceedings. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect what was coming. "Because I need to move my liquid assets somewhere safe before the lawsuits begin," Marcus explained, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I need someone I can trust to hold them. Someone my creditors won't think to investigate. Someone who can help me hide money that would otherwise be seized." The request hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. He was asking me to help him commit financial fraud. He was asking me to be complicit in deceiving the courts and stealing from creditors. He was asking me to cross a line I had never crossed before. "Marcus, I can't do that," I said, standing up to leave. "Robert, please," he grabbed my arm. "I'm not asking you to take the money. I'm just asking you to let me transfer it to your accounts temporarily. 6 months. That's all I need. Just enough time for things to settle down and for me to restructure my business." I looked into his eyes and saw genuine desperation. I saw a man drowning and reaching for the only life preserver in sight. And against every rational instinct, against every moral principle I had built my life on, I agreed. What follows is the story of how that decision destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and the meaning of trust. The money arrived in my accounts the following week. $3.2 million distributed across 3 different banks, each transfer carefully documented with receipts and explanations that were technically legal, but spiritually dishonest. Marcus told me it was his personal investment portfolio, being moved for tax purposes. The banks didn't question it. I didn't question it. I had already made the decision to stop questioning things. My wife, Diana, noticed the balance increase in our primary checking account when she was paying the monthly bills. "Robert, did you get a bonus at work?" she asked, looking at the statement with confusion. I should have told her the truth right then. I should have confessed everything before it became a secret that festered between us like an infection. Instead, I lied. "An investment paid off better than expected," I said, hating myself even as the words left my mouth. "An old fund I had forgotten about." She seemed to accept the explanation, but I could see doubt flicker in her eyes. After 23 years of marriage, Diana had developed an instinct for when I was lying. It was something in my voice, in the way I avoided direct eye contact, in the subtle tension in my shoulders. She didn't push the issue, but I could feel something shift between us that day. A small crack in the foundation that would eventually widen into an unbridgeable chasm. The first month passed without incident. The money sat in my accounts, inert and accusatory, like a loaded gun in a glass case marked, "In case of emergency." I checked the balances obsessively, half expecting federal agents to show up at my door with arrest warrants. Every phone call made me anxious. Every unexpected email seemed like a summons. Then Marcus called again with an update that made everything infinitely worse. "Robert, I have a situation," he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping back into his voice. "One of the creditors is being more aggressive than I expected. He's hired investigators. They've already started looking at my accounts. Marcus, you need to get this money back to me now," I said, panic rising in my throat. "I can't have this hanging over my head." I know, he replied. "But I need you to do me a favor first. I need you to move the money to a new account. An offshore account. Somewhere the investigators can't follow the trail." This was the moment where I should have said no. This was the moment where I should have told him that I was done, that I had made a terrible mistake, that I wanted no part of this scheme anymore. But by then I was in too deep. I had already lied to my wife. I had already crossed the line from ordinary citizen to financial criminal. Taking another step seemed almost inevitable. I contacted a financial firm that specialized in international investments. Through a series of carefully crafted instructions, I moved Marcus's money to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Belize. The money was now hidden, unreachable, committed to the shadows. 3 weeks later, there was a knock on my door at 6 in the morning. 2 federal agents stood on my porch, both with the same grim expression that suggested they had done this 1,000 times before. They showed me a warrant and explained that I was under investigation for money laundering and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. They explained my rights. They explained what I was facing legally. And they explained that if I cooperated fully, there might be leniency in my sentencing. The world stopped. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, everything I was shattered in that moment like a dropped glass. They arrested me right there in my own house, while my neighbors watched from their windows. Diana woke to find me being handcuffed in our living room. The look on her face was worse than any physical pain I had ever experienced. It was betrayal. It was disappointment. It was the complete death of whatever trust we had built over 2 decades of marriage. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Marcus had done, and by extension what I had done. He had stolen from dozens of investors. He had forged documents. He had created shell companies. And I, in my desire to help a man I barely knew, had become his unwitting accomplice in a scheme that would eventually cost 17 different people their entire life savings. One victim was a 74-year-old retired teacher who had invested her pension with Marcus. Another was a small business owner who had trusted Marcus with capital intended to expand his company. The human cost of our dishonesty was devastating and irreversible. My trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence that was, frankly, damning. The financial transfers, the offshore accounts, the attempts at deception. My own lawyer admitted that I had essentially no defense. I had knowingly participated in a scheme to hide assets from creditors and investigators. I was convicted on 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 count of money laundering. The sentence was 8 years in federal prison. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of the real punishment. Diana filed for divorce while I was awaiting sentencing. She couldn't look at me. Every time I tried to explain myself, to justify my actions, she would leave the room. The woman I had loved and built a life with for 23 years had essentially ceased to exist in my presence. I had become a ghost in my own marriage. My daughter Sarah, who was 21 years old and in her 3rd year of college, stopped taking my calls. I later learned from mutual friends that she had told people I was a criminal who deserved everything that was coming to him. The shame of having a father in prison for financial crimes had isolated her socially and academically. She eventually withdrew from school, took a job as a bartender, and moved to another state specifically to get away from the stigma. My career was over. The hardware store owner, sensing that my arrest would be bad publicity, let me go before I even reported to prison. I had been making a decent salary, but it was nothing compared to what a federal prison sentence would cost me. Legal fees, The property I had lost to government asset seizure. The restitution I would eventually owe to the victims of Marcus's fraud. 11 years. That's how long it took from the moment I agreed to help Marcus until I walked through the gates of federal prison Camp Allenwood in Pennsylvania. 11 years of watching my life disintegrate. 11 years of watching my family scatter like frightened birds. 11 years of carrying the weight of my mistake. But prison, strange as it sounds, was almost a relief. When I arrived at Allenwood at 55 years old, I knew that in some fundamental way, the worst was already behind me. My marriage was destroyed. My career was over. My daughter refused to see me. The only thing left to lose was my freedom, and in a twisted way, losing that freedom felt like a kind of liberation. I was assigned to the education department, helping other inmates study for their GED and prepare for rehabilitation programs. It was the only thing that gave my days meaning, the only way I could make some kind of restitution for what I had done. The men I worked with were mostly young, mostly angry, mostly convinced that the system was rigged against them. I couldn't argue with them. They were right. But I could teach them. I could show them that even though the legal system might be corrupt, that didn't mean their lives had to be corrupt. I could encourage them to make better choices than I had made. The thing about mistakes, I told a young man named Deshaun who was studying for his GED, is that they don't just affect you. They echo outward. They hurt people you care about. They destroy things you can't rebuild. Deshaun looked at me with cynical eyes. You talking from experience or from a book? Experience, I replied. Bad experience. The kind of experience I wouldn't wish on anybody. Something in my honesty seemed to reach him. Deshaun became one of my most dedicated students. By the time I was released, he had not only gotten his GED but had started reading college-level textbooks in preparation for a potential university education after his release. I was granted early release after serving 5 years and 3 months due to good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. I walked out of Allenwood on a Tuesday morning in October, and I had absolutely no idea where to go. Diana had moved to Portland, Oregon and remarried. Sarah had built a new life in Denver, married a man named James, and had 2 children who had never met their grandfather. My parents had passed away while I was in prison, and I had missed both of their funerals because I couldn't get permission to attend. I checked into a halfway house in Philadelphia and got a job at a grocery store for $9 an hour. I was 59 years old, a convicted felon, and completely alone. But I also had something I hadn't had in years: clarity about who I was and what I had done. One of the conditions of my release was that I attend therapy sessions with a court-appointed counselor. Her name was Dr. Elena Vasquez, and she was the kind of therapist who didn't accept excuses. "You're telling me why you did this," she said during our 3rd session. "But you're not telling me what you've learned from it." "I've learned that I'm capable of being dishonest," I replied. "I've learned that I can rationalize almost anything if I convince myself that the motivation is good enough." "That's a start," Dr. Vasquez said. "But what else?" "I've learned that my choices affect other people in ways I can never fully control or predict. I've learned that trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. I've learned that there are no shortcuts to redemption." She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Here's what I think, Robert. I think you've spent 5 years in prison, and you're still punishing yourself. I think that's probably appropriate for what you did. But I also think you're at a crossroads. You can either spend the rest of your life defined by your worst decision, or you can spend it trying to become a better person than the one who made that decision." Those words became my guiding principle for the next phase of my life. I spent 3 years in that halfway house, 3 years working minimum wage jobs, 3 years attending therapy sessions and AA meetings even though I had never been an alcoholic, because I understood that addiction to the feeling of being needed and being trusted was every bit as destructive as addiction to substances. 3 years slowly building a reputation as a man who showed up on time, did his work and didn't cause problems. When I was finally released from supervision, I was 62 years old, and I had saved approximately $14,000. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get a small apartment and start over again. I got a job as a night security guard at a medical office building, a job that paid slightly better than the grocery store, and allowed me to be alone with my thoughts for hours at a time. For the first time in many years, I thought about reaching out to Sarah. She was 31 years old now, living in Denver with her husband and their 2 children. I had no idea if she would even take my call. For 10 years she had had no contact with me. As far as she knew, I was the man who had destroyed their family for selfish financial reasons. But I had learned something in prison and in therapy. I had learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to stop running from the people you've hurt and face them directly, knowing that forgiveness might not be possible. I called her on a Sunday morning, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. "Hello." She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice unfamiliar after so many years. "Sarah, it's your father. I don't expect you to want to talk to me, and if you want to hang up right now, I understand completely. But I wanted you to know that I'm alive, I'm free, and I'm sorry." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I don't even know what to say to you," she said finally. "You destroyed this family." "I know," I replied. "And I can't undo that. I can't give back those years. I can't make your childhood less painful than it was. All I can do is tell you that I understand what I did, and I'm sorry for it." "That's not enough," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I know it's not enough," I replied. "But it's what I have to offer." She hung up after that, and I didn't hear from her again for 6 months. I didn't know if she would ever want to speak to me again. But I had made peace with that possibility. I had done what I could. The rest was up to her. One day, completely unexpectedly, I received a letter in the mail. It was in handwriting I didn't recognize, but when I opened it, I saw it was from Sarah. The letter was short, just 2 paragraphs, but it changed everything. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said. I've been thinking about it for 6 months. I'm still angry with you. I probably always will be angry with you, at least to some degree. But I'm also tired of being angry. My therapist told me that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I think maybe we should try to have a relationship again, but slowly. My kids don't know you. I don't know if I want them to know you. But maybe we can start with coffee." I must have read that letter 100 times in the weeks that followed. I had no way of knowing if it meant real reconciliation, or just the smallest acknowledgement that I might still have a place in my daughter's life. But it was enough to give me hope. We met for coffee at a Starbucks in Denver 3 weeks later. Sarah was 32 years old now, and I was a stranger to her. We sat awkwardly across from each other, making small talk about the weather and her job as an administrative assistant. After an hour, she looked at me directly and asked a question that surprised me. "I've been reading about your case," she said. "I looked up everything online. I want you to know that I've read your letters. All of them. Every single one you sent me over the years, even the ones I didn't respond to." "I didn't know you had received them," I said quietly. "I didn't open them for years," she admitted. "But eventually I did. And I could see in them how much you were suffering. And I realized that maybe suffering wasn't enough punishment for what you did, but it was something." Over the next year, Sarah and I gradually rebuilt something that resembled a relationship. I met her husband, James, and he was surprisingly kind to me, a man who had no obligation to be kind to the father of his wife, a man who had caused so much pain in her life. Slowly, Sarah began allowing me to spend time with my grandchildren, Emma and Michael. They didn't understand who I was or why I had been absent from their lives. But they were 6 and 8 years old, and children have a remarkable capacity for forgiveness if given the chance. I continued working as a security guard, making barely enough money to survive. But I used the small income one had to help Sarah's family. I started a college fund for Emma and Michael. I contributed to their mortgage payments. I was careful not to overextend myself or create any kind of dependency, because I had learned that lesson the hard way. At 65 years old, I started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that worked with ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives after prison. I told them my story. I showed them that it was possible to come back from rock bottom. I encouraged them to reach out to their families, to take responsibility for their actions, and to understand that redemption was a process, not a destination. The worst thing that can happen to you, I told a room of about 30 people who had all recently been released from various federal prisons, is that you start believing that you're defined by your worst decision. You're not. You're defined by what you do after that decision. You're defined by whether you give up, or whether you keep trying to be better. One evening, after one of these meetings, a young man named Thomas approached me. "Mr. Robert, I want you to know that my father was one of the victims of a Ponzi scheme similar to the one you were involved in. He lost his entire retirement savings. He never recovered from it. He died 3 years ago, broken. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't offer him anything that would make up for what had happened to his father. I couldn't bring his father back. I couldn't return the money that had been stolen. All I could do was stand there and acknowledge the reality of what my actions had contributed to. I'm sorry, I said, and the words seemed impossibly inadequate. I can't change what happened to your father. All I can tell you is that I understand how my actions were part of a system that destroyed people's lives. I know, Thomas said. That's why I wanted you to know that I appreciate what you're doing now, even though I know it doesn't change the past. That conversation, more than any other single moment, forced me to confront the reality that redemption is not about erasing the harm you've caused. It's about acknowledging that harm, taking responsibility for it, and then spending whatever time you have left trying to minimize future harm and help others avoid making the same mistakes. By the time I reached 70 years old, I had rebuilt a relationship with my daughter, gotten to know my grandchildren, and created a life that had meaning beyond my initial crime. I had also become acutely aware that I would carry the weight of what I had done for the rest of my life. There would be days when I would be flooded with guilt about the people Marcus's fraud had destroyed. There would be nights when I couldn't sleep because I was thinking about the retired teacher who had lost her pension, the small business owner who had lost his dream. But I had also learned that carrying that weight was not punishment. It was responsibility. It was the price of living with integrity after living for so many years without it. One afternoon, while I was sitting in my small apartment reading a book, I received a call from a law firm. An attorney named Richard Bennett explained that Marcus, my stepson, had died. He had suffered a heart attack while on vacation in Mexico. But before his death, something remarkable had happened. Marcus had become a Christian. He had joined a faith community in the city where he was living. And he had made a decision that shocked me when I heard about it. In his will, he had left detailed instructions that a significant portion of his remaining assets, over $3 million, were to be distributed to the victims of his fraud as restitution. Mr. Robert, the attorney explained, I'm reading from his written statement here. He said, I have destroyed many lives with my dishonesty. I cannot undo that harm, but I can take full responsibility for it and use whatever resources I have left to try to minimize that harm. To everyone I have hurt, I say I am sorry. I take full responsibility. I deserve nothing, and I'm grateful for every moment of this second chance I've been given. I wept when I heard those words. Not because Marcus had finally taken responsibility, though that mattered. I wept because I understood that if he could change, if a man as dishonest as Marcus could eventually choose to face what he had done, then there was hope for redemption in the world. Real redemption, difficult redemption, incomplete redemption, but redemption nonetheless. The next chapter of my life was shaped by this new information. Working with the law firm, I became an advocate for restitution programs that allowed people who had committed financial crimes to compensate their victims. I spoke at conferences. I wrote articles. I used my experience to help shape policy that encouraged accountability, rather than just punishment. Sarah gave me a book for my 70th birthday. It was a collection of interviews with people who had been released from prison and had successfully rebuilt their lives. My story was included. Reading about myself through the eyes of a journalist who had interviewed me about my journey was surreal and humbling. Robert, in these years since your release, you've helped hundreds of people. But you've also had to live with the reality that you can never fully repair the harm you caused. The interviewer had written, how do you reconcile that? My answer, which I had forgotten about until reading it again, was simple. I don't reconcile it. I live with it. I accept that some things cannot be fixed. I accept that some people will never forgive me. And I use that understanding to motivate me to help others so that maybe, in some small way, the harm is balanced by good. At 72 years old, I was recruited to help develop a new program at the federal prison where I had served my time. The program was designed to help inmates understand the full impact of their crimes on their victims. It was called the Accountability Initiative, and it was revolutionary in its approach. Instead of focusing purely on punishment, it focused on helping prisoners understand human cost of their actions. I returned to Allenwood as a volunteer educator, walking the same hallways where I had spent 5 years of my life. The experience was profoundly moving and profoundly difficult. I saw my own younger self in so many of the faces I encountered. I saw men who were just beginning to understand what they had done, and men who had been incarcerated for so long that they had become hardened to their own crimes. I told them my story. All of it. The part where I was dishonest. The part where I hurt people. The part where I destroyed my own family. And the part where I had to spend decades trying to rebuild what I had broken. The most important thing you can do, I told them, is to stop making excuses. Stop telling yourself that what you did wasn't so bad. Stop focusing on why society is unfair. Focus instead on what you did, who you hurt, and what you're going to do to become a better person than the one who committed that crime. Some of them listened. Most of them didn't. But for the few who did, the few who had that moment of genuine self-awareness, I knew the program was working. For my 75th birthday, Sarah and my grandchildren came to visit me for the weekend. We went hiking at a state park, and I watched my grandchildren play and laugh without any understanding of the complicated history that had brought us to this moment. Emma was 14 years old and had just been accepted to the competitive high school she wanted to attend. Michael was 11 and played soccer with a passion that reminded me of Ethan, my own biological son, before my decisions had torn our family apart. That evening, sitting on the back porch of my small house, Sarah asked me a question that I had been expecting for years, but had never actually heard. Dad, if you could go back and talk to yourself at the moment you agreed to help Marcus, what would you say? I thought about that for a long time before answering. I would say that helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing your integrity. I would say that the people you think are asking for your help are often actually asking for your complicity in their dishonesty. I would say that the cost of dishonesty is exponentially higher than you can possibly imagine in the moment you choose it. And I would say that the life you can build by being honest, even when it's painful, is infinitely more valuable than any amount of money you could acquire through deception. Sarah nodded and took my hand. I'm glad you're my dad, she said quietly. I'm glad that you became the person you are now, even though I wish you hadn't had to go through all of that to get here. As I sit here today, 77 years old, I understand that my life has been divided into clear chapters. The chapter where I was dishonest, the chapter where I paid for that dishonesty, and the chapter where I've been trying to live with integrity and help others do the same. I don't expect forgiveness for what I did. I don't expect people to forget the harm I caused. What I do expect is that each day I wake up, I have the opportunity to be a better person than I was the day before. And that, ultimately, is the only redemption that matters. My greatest wish is that this story serves as a warning to others. I wish that someone reading this might stop themselves before they make the same choice I made. I wish they might understand that there are no situations so dire that they justify dishonesty. I wish they might see that the moment of temptation I gave into was the moment when I needed to be most honest, most principled, most unwilling to compromise my integrity. 15 years after I left prison, I received an email from a woman named Catherine who had heard my story at a speaking engagement. She wrote to tell me that her son had been considering committing financial fraud to help a struggling friend. After hearing my story, he had decided against it. Instead, he had been honest with his friend about what he could and couldn't do to help. The friendship had actually strengthened because of that honesty. Thank you, Catherine wrote, for using your pain to help prevent another family from experiencing the devastation that your crime caused yours. That email is the only redemption I need. It's enough to know that my story might have prevented even one person from making the mistake I made. It's enough to know that the decades I spent rebuilding my life had some value beyond my own recovery. If you're listening to this story right now, and you're facing a situation similar to the one I faced with Marcus, I want to say this directly to you. You don't have to do it. You don't have to compromise your integrity. You don't have to lie to protect someone else's dishonesty. The cost of that choice is far higher than you can possibly imagine right now. And the life you can build by being honest, even when it's difficult, is far more valuable than any benefit you could gain through deception. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it. We live in a world where dishonesty is rewarded in so many contexts that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that integrity still matters. Integrity always matters. And it's never too late to choose it, even after you've already chosen against it. Did you like this story? Which part spoke to you the most? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more stories about redemption and accountability, please subscribe to the channel. There's so much more on this platform that deals with these important themes. See you in the next story, and remember, your choices matter far more than you can ever know.